Arthur Rimbaud.
Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Electric Eel. Okay, tonight I've mixed up a pure white with some linseed oil and a little bit of liquid to start lining in the patterning across and into the depth of the eel. So here we go.
Sitting around a highly polished conference room table with a chart going down in the back, obviously the profits of the company. And the chairman of the board is saying to this little man who has obviously just said something, he's saying, "You're right, Higgins, that a deliberate disordering of the senses worked for Rimbaud, but would it work for us?" Probably not for Acme Corporation, but it will work for us. And the way it's achieved is by dissolving the chemical stability that lies behind the mental and cultural stabilities. In other words, going to a very deep level, going to the molecular architecture of the brain itself, and then making changes, and for reasons mysterious and certainly worthy of discussion, we are accompanied on this planet by dozens and dozens of plants that do this and do very little else. In other words, pose no problem to the physical integrity of the body or the long-term integrity of the culturally constructed normal mind, but which for minutes or hours dissolve the three-dimensional threat detector construct of the mind and replace it with something else. And then we can talk about what is the something else. William James said of the newborn infant, he said, "We are born into a blooming, buzzing confusion," which is a pretty good description of the first 30 seconds of a DMT flash. It's a blooming, buzzing confusion. Well, then is it simply that all reality is psychedelic, that if you spend enough time in any reality, it tends to mundanize? Is that it? And if you could be high on DMT for 4 years, at the end of it, you would navigate it the way a 4-year-old child navigates this world? Perhaps. Probably so, although possibly not. So there might
come in with that kind of chaotic.
Yeah, we do. But when you burst into the DMT space, you don't arrive as the tabula rasa of the newborn infant. You arrive with your Husserl and your Pythagoras and all the rest of it fully intact in your hip pocket if you need to use it. Well, so long before written culture, long before cities, so forth and so on, this potential for the dissolving and recrystallizing of the mind through the use of plants had been discovered. It may have been one of the very earliest discoveries of human beings. It, I believe, and argued in my book, Food of the Gods, that these things actually synergize high states of information processing and transfer, that spoken language itself is a kind of overflowing of the cup of thought into the verbal circuitry that is occasioned by pushing the human envelope with the presence of psychedelic compounds. And the way this works in a shamanistic society is most Aboriginal societies have located in their environment plants that are effective in causing this sort of state to occur. And these will be inevitably, with very few exceptions, indole-containing plants. All of the interesting psychedelics, with the exception of mescaline, which is an amphetamine, and alpha-salvinorin, which is, I believe, an isoquinoline, everything is an indole. LSD, DMT, psilocybin, ibogaine, and it's quite a small family. They are all serotonin antagonists, and they are all structural competitors for the bond site, the receptor site in the nervous system where all of this stuff goes on. I suppose we should talk, or at least mention, the fact that the use of these things is illegal in most societies and furiously suppressed in some societies. I don't find this very interesting. I just think it has to do with the suppression of most effective means for getting out of culture. Sex itself would be illegal if they could find a way to make it so. It obviously seems to threaten the social order as much as psychedelics. Well, so then if you're interested in these things beyond the mere abstract acquisition of data, then there's a lot of detail work ahead of you. You have to learn a lot about plants, a lot about Aboriginal cultures, a lot about chemistry, and a lot about yourself. And then you bring all this together and search for a tool that works for you. And, you know, human beings are highly variable. I took a course years ago from Sasha, and there were about 500 people in this class. It was a class in forensic chemistry, of all things. And at one point he brought in a test tube a little compound that was passed around and sniffed. And out of 500 people, 2 had a violent physical reaction to this stuff. And then he told us the range of sensitivity in human beings to this compound is over 3 orders of magnitude. And yet, so the person sitting next to you could be 10,000 times more sensitive to this chemical than you are. So you sort of have to learn the landscape of your own nervous system. Some people, there are powerful shamanic systems, for example, built on daturas, tropanes, the things that occur in Jimson weed and these arborescent daturas that you see used in landscaping with the beautiful pendulous, fragrant flowers. Those contain powerful mind-altering substances. I can't take those things because I become delirious. It's a useless state to me. I become confused. And many people, that's their reaction. But maybe 1 in 50 has a different set of receptors for this and can hold presence and work through it. So you need to study the classic shamanic hallucinogen-using complexes in the world, and they are, without an effort to be exhaustive, the psilocybin complex in Mexico, based on many species of mushrooms occurring there, especially in the Sierra Mazteca. The ayahuasca complex in the Amazon basin, which is a combinatory thing made of 2 plants which synergize each other. The iboga complex in Western Africa, which runs on ibogaine, which is derivative of Tabernanthe iboga. The peyote complex of the American Southwest, and then arguably not a psychedelic, but since arguably we will include it, the worldwide presence of the cannabis complex in different manifestations. So, and then of course the entire issue of synthetic chemistry. It's often been thought that I am some kind of monotheist about plants and denounce all synthetic chemistry. It isn't from some kind of absolute. It's simply that with synthetic chemistry, you don't have the kind of database you have with a plant. Take a plant, ayahuasca, probably been used 5,000 or 6,000 years. So we have our human data sample. We know that this doesn't cause blindness, miscarriage, birth defects, madness, so forth and so on. A drug fresh out of the laboratory that you've had a good response from 12 people with is by no means suddenly safe. I mean, tens of thousands of people have to take this drug for many years before you can absolutely certify. And the other thing to remember is no drug is safe. You can kill yourself with water if you drink enough of it. Drugs are poisons. This is what they are. And the question is, the judicious use of poisons elicits certain responses, but you definitely want to have this understanding. Well, so then there's a vast literature about all this, an anthropological literature, a chemical literature, and to some degree a philosophical and analytical literature. Reading all these descriptions, you eventually, something attracts you. And then the question is how to do it. And the way to do it, I think, especially in the beginning, is in silent darkness, on an empty stomach. You don't want to see the culture psychedelically put through a psychedelic filter. You want to see the ding-on-seesh of it, the thing in itself. So you just want to put a black and silent screen behind it. And people say, well, but won't it be boring? Having obviously meditated. No, it's not like that. People who are honest meditators will tell you that it's the most boring undertaking in the world, that somehow it's a metaphysic of boredom. That's what it is, but the way you do psychedelics is you sit and you close your eyes, but notice that when most people sit and close their eyes, they fall inward. They have closed their eyes, so why should they continue to look outward? But I think it's very important in the state of anticipation of the psychedelic, meaning before it comes on and as it comes on, to sit with eyes closed but looking. Simply imagine that there is a surface, a black surface, a foot in front of your face, and just watch it. And somehow this expectation of seeing is a permission to structures in the brain to begin to present. And then once, of course, the lock is made, it's often difficult to turn it off. But getting the channel tuned in right at the beginning can be tricky. And all the techniques of un-psychedelic spiritual pursuit work in the presence of psychedelics. In my experience, it's the only time they work. So in other words, pranayama, yantra, mantra, suddenly these things are become as advertised rather than, I've said it 10,000 times, I'm not sure I'm getting anywhere. So I think it's very good to imbibe these knowledge of these spiritual techniques and have your mantras folded and ready at your elbow when you plunge in there. Yeah.
A small digression. What about shamanic coaches?
This is an interesting question. And in anthropology, it's been a raging debate for 30 years or more. The definitive work on shamanism, or the great classic work on shamanism, is called Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy by Mircea Eliade. And Eliade was a Romanian who educated in France and became a brilliant academic, wrote one of the best books ever written on yoga, immortality, and freedom. Wrote a book that changed my life forever called Cosmos and History. Many books, a great historian of religion. But when Eliade came to the phenomenon of intoxication in shamanism, he completely reverted to his European constipated, male-dominator, French structuralist roots, And he said narcotic, this was the word he used, which notice the pharmacological imprecision of that. That right there tells you this person doesn't quite meet at the front of the line. But he said narcotic shamanism is decadent. Resort to drugs is decadent. Well, then Gordon Wasson, who was the discoverer of the mushroom complex, took exactly the opposite position and said shamanism in the absence of psychoactive plants is on its way to turning into ordinary priestcraft and religion. And in my experience, this is true. I mean, I agree with Wasson for the following reason. There is nothing intrinsically to be valued, I think, in suffering. I'm Buddhist enough to believe that there's enough suffering without inviting or creating it. So when you lay the psychedelic path next to the non-psychedelic but effective path, it's an ordeal. That's how it's done. You starve yourself, you go into the wilderness, you pierce yourself. You may, in fact, take plants that are not psychedelic, but that induce severe cramping or diarrhea or something like that. You may be flagellated. You may be covered with red ants. You may be hung upside down. You may be beaten senseless. I mean, clearly, to my mind, what this evinces is a kind of desperation to attain these states. Almost no price is too great. And, you start shedding blood in a tropical environment and you're up for grabs for severe septicemia and all sorts of things. So it's a very heavy thing. Meanwhile, these plants, you prepare the concoction, you take it, there may be a little gastric distress, there may be a little psychological distress, but no matter how bad it gets, 6 to 12 hours later, you're able to tell the story around the campfire, and you have smoothly, cleanly cut to the center of the mandala and returned. So I think if we are saying that entry into the shamanic world is to be achieved by technique, and all scholars of shamanism agree with this, well then as you lay these techniques side by side, clearly the use of hallucinogenic plants is more sophisticated in the sense that we judge a Maserati to be more sophisticated than a coach and four. It simply goes faster, works smoother, is more comfortable, and gets you there in better shape. Now, some cultures are in the unfortunate position, not many, but some, of having no really effective hallucinogen in their cultural area. And in almost every case, they have found a way. And people will go to great lengths. I'm sure, as you know, an example of both a poor, in my mind, a poor, although there are people who would rise up in holy wrath over this, but the Amanita muscaria cults of western Siberia among the Tunguska and Kamchatka people. I've taken Amanita muscaria. I know many people who've taken it. It's an extremely trying experience at best. And I don't think you could build a religion of ecstasy around it unless you were in a desperately sensory-deprived environment with no other intoxicants available. To support my argument, the Amanita cults collapsed almost immediately upon contact with vodka. And so, in other words, in the minds of these Siberian shamans, these two vehicles laid side by side, their traditional mushroom and vodka was to be preferred. People have made much of Amanita muscaria, but even its most enthusiastic proponents admit that they could never get off. So that's a severe mark against one of these things. They must be effective. One of the things that has held up the development of this field, I briefly mentioned it yesterday, was the unwillingness of researchers to experience these things. You know, to go and live with an Aboriginal people and see that every new and full moon they take something and the whole society goes through changes, and then they talk of nothing else until the next time they take it, and this is what they live for, and you're studying their language and their value system and all this, and you don't do it. It makes no sense at all. And yet, until very recently, if you were to do it, your colleagues back at Miss Atomic University would whip their knives out and denounce you as unprofessional, going back to the bush, not good method, so forth and so on. So there's been an enormous phobia about contacting this by academics, and so it's been left to countercultures, to fringe people, to individual experimenters, to eccentrics of various types. And in the underground, then, an enormous database has been built up. Nobody knows as much about psychedelics as people in the underground, because they're the people who've actually taken them, correlated the data, and kept track of it. So we have an official science of pharmacology, and then we have this oddly developing subculture. And, it used to be, 10 years ago, I suppose, that a genuine shaman was a person in a traditional culture ministering to the needs of a tribal group somewhere. Now, there are a large number, I don't know, thousands of people who I consider full-fledged shamans and full-fledged members of cyber-electric culture. I mean, shamanism is not necessarily a phenomenon of the upriver and off-road. So there are people who have all the tools of Western science and epistemology. They've been to Harvard, they've studied philosophy and science and all of mathematics, and they are fully empowered with the tools of archaic shamanism. They've been to these places. And strangely enough, in many cases, these are some of the most creative people in the culture. I mean, I don't think he would mind me mentioning him in this context. Somebody like Mark Pesce, who is, a full-on psychedelic techno-pagan and the genius who created VRML, which is going to let us all walk into cyberspace. High-tech and shamanic cultures are almost overlapping in this country. And I think it has to do with the fact that, and this is what I mentioned last night, talking about the toxicity of ideology, that we're moving into a post-ideological world. We're moving into a world where the bankruptcy of ideology is obvious. All ideologies are faiths. Even science can be demonstrated to be a faith that rests on certain revealed truths which are never questioned. To build a non-toxic future, we are going to simply have to solve many of our problems pragmatically. For instance, right now, we have many problems. AIDS, overpopulation, this and that. All of these problems could be solved, except that we have one rule when we approach a problem. The solution must make money. There are many problems where there is no solution that makes money. So if you refuse any solution but that type, you're upriver. Well, anyway, that's a slight digression. Yeah, sure, lead me back.
However, I will say that there are a few on my bookshelf, and that's a horrible way to do it. And I agree with you. I really agree with you. But there are a few on my bookshelf. Franklin Merrill Wolf would be one. Gopi Krishna would be another. Yogananda, from people that I've met that spend time with him, might be a third. I feel better about the first two. There are people in history that really seem to be beatific.
Well, Aldous Huxley said a very interesting thing about psychedelics, and I think it addresses this. He said of psychedelics, he said, it is a gratuitous grace. Now, what does this mean? It means it is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation. It is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation, but it certainly helps. It's so taking psychedelics doesn't make you a superior person.
All right, so as you can see, I'm just sort of building up little clusters of shapes going along kind of a grid that will be overlaid on top of all of the space of the electric eel body, and then pinching and getting smaller as it tapers into the distance, and then I will conjoin them with smaller shapes in between each of the larger clusters. So it's going to take a little while. I think I'm going to do a second session after I take a short break here. Take two, coming up.
Once on a beach in Asia, stoned
Take
on
two.
LSD, and a little crab came along and cleaned my fingernails, every one of them. It just moved from fingernail to fingernail. It had this little claw, and it etched them out, and it took a long time, and I was just like this, and it would climb down one finger, go out to the other one, finish, go down here, and how only Buddha or LSD can give you that kind of power to sit still.
I think it's, and maybe I've misunderstood people, but I think it's a really weird construct to dichotomize humans from nature. We don't say that ants or the termites have separated themselves up from nature by building a termite hill, which is a really good skyscraper for termites. And why all of a sudden when man goes out and builds a skyscraper and puts himself in it, he no longer participates in nature. It seems so strange to me. I mean, because we're in a terrarium.
Well,
we can go leave. It's just
we have
it's such a weird thing to me to say that if you do certain things, sitting on the rock is in nature, sitting at the top of the World Trade Center is not. I mean, we can't judge that. We can't judge it. It just seems so strange to me.
Well, there's a categorical difference that people sense but can't always articulate. And what it is nature is a genetic machine of some sort. Everything is under the control of genes, except that when you get to human beings, there are these things called epigenetic behaviors. In other words, how you make a Chevrolet is not written into the DNA of human beings. The anthill is a genetic program, but what we are is freakily out of control of our genetic heritage. We don't behave like automata. We speak many languages. That's unheard of. A species which has localized communication systems, and yet that's how we do it. There is no human universal way of communicating. We've culturally fragmented that. Pardon me? Have local dialects? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, see, I think I don't want to get into huge arguments, but there's
Oh no, don't be shy.
different tribes of gorilla crack nuts differently. Okay? I mean, it's not just a human characteristic. There are some that use a rock and a log. They put the nut in the log and they crack it. And there are other gorillas that can't crack nuts. And there are other gorillas. I mean, just because something is epigenetic does not mean it's a part of nature, right?
No, I agree with you, but I say people sense this difference. It would be quite astonishing if there were no epigenetic behavior outside of human beings. That would indicate it was some kind of descent from above. But I think when nature is fully understood, there will be no dramatic transitions. Everything is anticipated, everything is sort of, it begins as a theme and then rises to dominate the orchestra. The other and more exciting possibility is that we are entirely under the control of higher order genetic programming, and that history is a genetic process that has a purpose, and that it is like gestation or fruition or something, and that, a good example to have in your intellectual toolbox is the slime mold. Slime molds are these organisms which have a very peculiar life cycle. Let's cut in at a random point in their life cycle, and what we find are amoeba-like creatures, almost microscopic, living in the soil, the decaying leaves and stuff of the forest floor. They look like single-celled amoeba, but at a certain point, one of these individual amoeba undergoes some kind of stimulus. It's not well understood, and it begins to emit a chemical signal which says, "Come to where I am." And these amoeba, which may be spread out over a few square yards of the forest floor, they all begin to congregate at this spot where this chemical signal is being broadcast from. And as they arrive by the millions, the original cell and the first arrivals on the scene are literally lifted into the air by the arrival of millions and millions of individuals, and this thing forms, which is a couple of inches long and has a pointed stalk on it. And now we're looking at a macrophysical organism with a weight in grams, and it then sporulates and bursts, and these spores spread out through the air and descend to the forest floor and become these free-living amoeboid things, and the whole cycle starts over again. So what is this? Is this an animal that is dissolved into its cells at one stage of its existence? Or is it millions of animals that at one stage of their existence aggregate together to form something roughly analogous to a human city? I prefer the former explanation. It seems to me that, and we are like that, and history could well be a process like that. Something is torn loose in our species having to do with information processing and coding, and we literally have a symbiotic relationship with the word. And Western civilization begins, in principio et verbum et verbo caro factum est. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word is made flesh. So we're like the carriers of this strange relationship to a logos, a kind of mind that doesn't seem to be made of matter, but that seems to permeate this planet. And various cultures contact this on various levels. I mean, this is the spirit world of the shaman. This is the logos world of the Greek golden age, so forth and so on. And some societies call it God, and some call it Gaia, and some call it illusion. But all societies are aware of it as a potential experience. I think history has a purpose, and that the obvious no-way backness of it indicates that it is some kind of process that is designed. It is not a random walk. It's not the accumulation of endless blunders. It actually has a purpose and an intent, and it's a style. And when it is fulfilled, it will be replaced by something else. Yeah, do you all understand? The meme is kind of, you could say it's the basic, if genes are the basic units of biology, memes are the basic units of ideology and culture. So fascism is a meme. Madonna is a meme. All ideologies and all short-term cultural phenomena are memes, and these memes compete. Whatever happened to Boy George? That kind of thing. Apparently, some go extinct, and they can be replicated. I mean, when I tell you, when you repeat my opinion, it means you have copied the meme. in the same way that you could copy a gene. And when I write a book, I am replicating my inner memes and sending out thousands of copies, somewhat analogous to a virus. And so inside society, these memes are competing. That's what Buchanan means when he talks about cultural war. It's the meme war that he's talking about. Shall we be white, Christian, upright, rectitudinous human beings, or shall we be dope-smoking, homoerotic, blah, 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 blah. These are all memes. And as you said very well, they compete. And the human world is an environment in which these memes compete. And hopefully over time there is some kind of maximization of something. I don't want to say progress, although casually people speak of progress, like we're supposed to believe that Heidegger is somehow has a deeper insight into reality than, I don't know, I wouldn't say Plato. I don't think there's been progress there. But who what? Was a bad example. The psychedelic meme is a perfect example. I mean, that's a very strong, coherent, definable meme. It's been furiously suppressed, but continues to survive. It's a healthy meme. It's able to infect rapidly and spread through populations, and somehow they accrue some benefit to it, and so it's preserved. I don't know how we got off on this. Anybody else? Anything else? We still haven't really gotten to what I planned to talk about this morning, and we're almost done. That's a good sign. Well, it was basically just to make sure you're fully up to speed on the psychedelic options available. No pun intended. For example, if you have a problem with the illegality of some of these substances, then alpha-salvinorin or salvia divinorum is a new plant and a new compound on the scene, not scheduled, not illegal, perfectly okay to grow, possess, advocate, give people, so forth and so on, and quite radical dislocation of the senses, in Rimbaud's phrase, occurs with this. It also has some interesting technical aspects to it. The most impressive being it's active at the 1 milligram level, 1,000 micrograms of this stuff, and it's smoked. So this is a 1 milligram smokable psychedelic that knocks the pins out from under you pretty dramatically for about 45 minutes. The leaf can be chewed, the plant can be grown as a house plant, so forth and so on. So that's one option that's available. The other thing you might, salvia divinorum, yeah.
I'm growing some in my neighborhood, and so what do I do with it? How do I?
If you just want to take the leaf, get some big leaves, and there's some controversy about how much you need or whether a lot is more than a little. But anyway, I took 35 grams. So, but it was a huge mouthful, I must say. So try 20 grams and weigh it, remove the mid-vein so it loses volume, roll it up into a package and shove it in your mouth and lie down in darkness and slowly squeeze and chew it in order to expel this juice into your mouth and lie still. And after about 15 or 20 minutes, you'll see what's called streaming, violet blobs of light sliding past your eyes. You see this after orgasm sometimes, and you see it in anticipation of psychedelics often. So that will happen. And about 3 minutes after that, it becomes dramatically visionary and quite bizarre. I mean, on a par with DMT, these stretching, sucking, liquid things, and very bright, the hallucinations. And interesting to me, I've never had this with any other compound. I was sitting in darkness in a house with a big pyramidal skylight and the moonlight shining in, the perfect circumstance for hallucinating with eyes open, sharp edges against darkness. Eyes open, there was absolutely nothing going on. I would close my eyes, and it was as dramatic as turning on a light. It was that quick. There was no transition. It was just I would close my eyes, and here would be these slowly undulating three-dimensional tunnels and recessional surfaces and stuff. So I find it quite fascinating. And then to the chemist, it's extremely fascinating because it's in a class of compounds unknown to contain psychoactive compounds. Well, now they're going back into it, and with liquid CO2 chromatography, very cold solvent chromatography, which is very precise and non-destructive, they're finding a whole family of these salvinorin compounds. And what this will lead to in terms of psychedelics treatments for mental illness, who knows, you know? It's amazing that 30 years, 40 years into the psychedelic revolution, we would discover not a new compound, Sasha does that 3 times a week, but a new family, a new chemical family with psychoactivity. That's a new continent in the world of neuropsychopharmacology. And then the other thing that people are doing that is very shamanic and challenging and good thing to do is, you probably all know about ayahuasca, this South American combinatory thing where a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, Banisteriopsis caapi, is combined with a source of tryptamine, DMT, usually Psychotria viridis. And because of the MAO inhibition in the gut, the tryptamine, which would normally be destroyed at that point, it passes through into the bloodstream and then passes the blood-brain barrier. So you can make DMT orally active if you complex it with the MAO inhibitor. Well, a whole bunch of people have realized that in most environments in the world, there are tryptamine sources. And so if you could combine them with an MAO inhibitor, you could create local variants on Amazonian ayahuasca. And they call this pharmahuasca, or anahuasca, meaning analog ayahuasca. And what people are doing is they're using Pagamen harmala as the MAO inhibitor, the seeds of Pagamen harmala. These are little black seeds, and you can get them from seed companies, or you can get them at Iranian markets, and they call it hurmal. And it's sold in Iranian markets to be thrown on hot charcoal to fumigate rooms. This is just a traditional use of it. It kills fleas. It's a very nice smelling thing and a kind of an incense. Well, if you take 2 grams of these little black seeds and grind them down, that will inhibit your MAO very effectively. And now, any DMT-containing plant that you orally ingest will become active. And it turns out that DMT is very, very common in nature. It's the commonest of all hallucinogens in nature. It occurs in numerous grasses, in leguminous trees. It occurs in the Rubiaceae. It occurs in the Myristicaceae. On and on, huge families implicated in this. It even occurs in certain species of fish. It occurs in human metabolism. This is interesting. A Schedule 1 drug that you are carrying around in your body, every man, woman, and child on this planet. Kind of the ultimate catch-22. Everybody is breaking the law. You must have realized that anyway. These things can be complex together. Now, some of the DMT sources that you might want to be aware of are phalaris grasses. These are prairie grasses, and some of these strains are pretty stiff. red turkey is a strain of Phalaris arundinacea that is pretty potent. There's a plant called Desmanthus illinoisensis, the Illinois bundleweed, which apparently was not used by the North American Indians. It's only been about 4 years that it has been discovered that the root bark of this plant is intensely contains DMT. And wildcrafters are now collecting it, and you can buy that plant. If you go to Mexico, there's a material sold in Mexican pharmacies called tepescovite, which is the root bark of Mimosa hostiles, the same plant implicated in Brazil in a cult of a drug called vino de jarema. That is a very mysterious and not well understood DMT preparation taken orally, apparently without an MAO inhibitor. Or the MAO inhibitor must also be present in the single plant from which it's prepared. Other sources of DMT, Lespedeza bicolor, that's a clover-like ground cover. Those are probably the main ones. So people are experimenting with these things and making pharmawaska, and in some cases getting off. I mean, there's a lot of clenched guts and hanging over the porcelain bowl in this line of research, but if you hit it right, you'll be very gratified. Yeah, well, that's the great thing about having an underground. You get human data that you could never get in a situation of government licensing because people are willing to take chances. I had a real bummer one time. I took half a dose of mushrooms and half a dose of ayahuasca, and it had me praying for mercy. It was not like anything I've seen some weird territory. But what this was apparent, as I analyzed it later, what must have been happening was short-term memory simply was not transcripting. And so I was sitting there, stoned out of my mind, and then this thought would come, something's wrong, something's wrong. So then I would search through pulse, heartbeat, nothing's wrong. Say, oh, nothing's wrong, okay. And go back to the trip. 15 seconds later, something's wrong. Say, nothing's wrong. Yeah, and it got loopier and loopier. And I remember that amazing scene in 2001 where the guy is outside the ship and he says, open the pod door, Hal. And he says, I can't do that, Dave. And I had this image of the molecular machinery jammed. I could almost see it. I could see the molecule locked in the synaptic receptor cleft, and it was like, and it was building toward panic. And I somehow got hold of myself, and I had a picture, which I'm sure you've all had this picture of myself in a locked ward somewhere. They check in once every 36 hours and wash down the walls. And then I just said, I'm just going to sit here until it leaves. And I did. And after about an hour of real hell, you could just almost feel it click and begin to drift out of the receptor, and then the chemical, the pharmacokinetic dynamics of the thing cutting. I said, oh, we're going to live to tell the tale, apparently. Yeah.
There is a wildflower that grows in spring in the fields in California that I don't know the name of it, it's like purple flowers, and if the plant's allowed to continue to grow, it becomes a woody stem, green leaf, sort of a sage green, with a stem of little purple flowers. I'm sure some of you must know what it is. They also come occasionally in yellow. When I walk through a field of those, I smell DMT. I know that DMT is there somewhere, but I have no idea.
I'm sure you're right. I mean, there's a yellow flowering tropical bohemia in a box garden near where I live in Hawaii, and the smell it just rivets you when you walk by. And many times I've been in the Amazon, like walking along a trail in the late afternoon.
Alright, this is going to take
and
considerably more
suddenly
time than I
it's
anticipated
just
for
and
right now.
strangely
I don't
enough,
think I'm going to make it
smell is
even
an
halfway through it, much less all the way to the other side
imprecise
of the eel.
sense. Standing in a jungle, smelling a strange
So
smell,
I'll zoom
and
in
asking
on the
question,
patterns thus
what makes
far.
this smell? There are thousands of sources. You know, you look around, you have no idea. But yeah, I think it occurs in as a volatile in flowers, as some kind of an attractant. It has a sweet, sharp, indolic smell that's very.
And I've done this
piercing.
sort of patterning before.
Yeah.
Developed it with this drawing called
Serine
Impossibility, or
that plant
Possibility
I mentioned
Cathedral,
as the source of an MAO inhibitor. If you're interested in making these, doing
and called it
experiments,
Visual
becoming a
Glossolalia.
shaman/alchemist and
The
experimenting,
syntax
making your
being
own pharmawasca,
the classic
get Jonathan
square,
Mott's
triangle,
book called
circle,
Ayahuasca
spiral.
Analogs. I think they have some copies here.
And then just variations
And,
on
he
that
describes
theme,
his self-experiments,
creating
and it's a little book, very useful. It's very
symbols
satisfying, I might
without
say, to
ascribed
make your own
definition.
stuff. I mean, I wrote a book with my brother
So-
years ago called Psilocybin, the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. Growing
That is going to be
really
covered
a wonderful
across the surface of the electric eel,
experience. I mean,
and
I don't
then
want to
colored
advocate
in each
it
individual solid shape,
absolutely, because
various
you could
colors, so it's going to be
dragged away
quite
for years. There's that little
bright and
detail.
vivid by the time it's done.
But
But that's it for the
absent
moment.
the way you
So thank you for
experience
watching.
the
That's Adam Sturch
organism
broadcasting
when
from the
you grow
Mushroom
it
Mansion,
is
Taos, New
incredible,
Mexico,
because
working on oil painting
you take
electric
a
eel.
$25
Have a good night, Earth.
sack of rye